On August 14, 2014, 22-year-old John Nelson and his 20-year-old brother Michael disappeared during a three-day hike in Zion National Park, Utah. A large-scale search operation involving two helicopters yielded nothing, with no sign of a struggle or trace of the camp. Exactly 1 year has passed. In September 2015, Michael's exhausted younger brother appeared at a Nevada hospital, claiming to have been held captive by a mysterious excavator. However, behind the facade of the miraculous rescue story, there was a mystery that made investigators doubt every word of the sole witness. In this video, you'll discover what really happened in the depths of the canyons during that year and what became of the older brother. On that particular morning, an SUV pulled into a parking lot near the start of the popular West Rim Trail, and two young men got out, John Nelson, 22, and his younger brother Michael, 20. John Nelson was a man known as a golden boy, a scholarship student at one of the country's most prestigious universities, and a future architect. With an exceptional mathematical mind, he always had a clear plan for every moment of his life. His friends described him as a confident, charismatic, and sometimes somewhat domineering leader. For him, this hike was the final court of summer, the last adventure before plunging into the whirlwind of a challenging school year. His younger brother Michael was the complete opposite of John. Quiet, reserved, and incredibly compliant, he remained in the shadow of his successful brother for years. In the Nelson family, Michael was considered the perfect partner. He never argued, always agreed with John's suggestions, and seemed to find peace simply by being near him. The brother's mother, Mary Nelson, later recalled in an interview with a local TV channel that, in the days leading up to his death, Michael had been behaving unusually. Instead of his usual apathy, he displayed a strange concentration that Mary interpreted as him being responsible. He spent hours in the garage methodically checking his equipment, tightening the straps of his backpacks, checking for leaks in his water containers, and reassembling his first aid kit several times. Her mother was a little anxious about this quiet preparation, but attributed it to the emotion of a long separation. John was going to study in another state. The West Rim Trail, approximately 24 kilometers long, is considered one of the most beautiful, but also the most treacherous trails in the park. It passes through high mountain plateaus and deep canyons with hundreds of meters of altitude change. The brothers planned a 3-day hike, taking with them enough food and water to last the entire time. They were last seen alive around 2 p.m. on August 14th near Stave Spring. A group of hikers from Colorado who were passing by the area remembered the two young men. According to one of the witnesses, Robert Miller, the brothers seemed like ordinary hikers, but there was one detail that struck him as odd. While John was carefully studying the map, trying to orient himself, his younger brother wasn't looking at the landscape or the path. He was staring intently at the back of his older brother's head, almost without blinking. There was no aggression in that look, just a strange, frozen attention that Robert later described as heavy. When John and Michael didn't return home on August 17th and didn't get in touch, their father contacted the National Park Service. The two brothers' phones were out of reach, which wasn't uncommon in the deep canyons of Zion, but their absence at the start of the trail at the appointed time meant an emergency. The following morning on August 18th, one of the largest search and rescue operations on Utah that season was launched. Two National Park Service helicopters circled the West Rim route for hours using thermal imagers. But the rocks, which were hot during the day, emitted so much heat that the devices became practically useless. Ground teams of experienced forest rangers and volunteers searched every inch of the slopes. The work was complicated because of the landscape. The area is full of narrow crevices that look like thin lines when viewed from above, but are actually deep traps tens of meters deep. Forest Ranger Mark Thompson, who led one of the groups, noted in his report, "These canyons are a veritable labyrinth. If a person is just 100 meters from the trail, it becomes an almost impossible mission to find them." On the 5th day of intensive searching, rescuers found the first and only clue. A blue baseball cap was found at the foot of one of the steep cliffs, in a remote area rarely visited by hikers. The parents immediately recognized the item. It was Michael's favorite cap. It was on a rock, looking almost new, as if someone had carefully placed it there instead of dropping it. But there was no other trace, No blood on the sharp rocks, no torn fabric from his clothes, no soul marks in the dry dust. The backpacks, the tents, and the brothers themselves seemed to have vanished into the hot canyon air. The search continued for another 10 days. Rescuers descended by ropes into the darkest crevices, where it was cold even during the day, but found only emptiness. The situation was aggravated by a sudden downpour transformed dry streams into raging torrents in the dead of night. In Zion, these floods are deadly. The water, mixed with sand and rocks, rushes at the speed of a train, sweeping away everything in its path. After the bad weather subsided, the chances of finding the brothers alive were officially considered zero. 2 weeks after the start of the operation, at the end of August 2014, the active phase of the search was suspended. The official version from the park rangers sounds dry and frightening: an accident. The investigation suggested that John and Michael, trying to shorten their route or find a water source, went off course and fell into one of the technical crevices that were subsequently washed away by sand during a torrential rain. Hope gave way to deep grief. The brothers' parents returned home, leaving their son's empty car in the parking lot, which was later towed away. The Nelsons' names joined the list of people missing in U.S. national parks, a long list of people whom nature has taken, leaving witnesses with no chance of answers. The case was officially closed and the brothers' names gradually disappeared from the news, remaining only as a painful wound in the family's heart, who had resigned themselves to the fact that they would never see their children again. However, the silence that reigned in the canyons of Zion was only an illusion of peace. A year passed during which the rocks continued to guard a secret that no one could even guess. In early September 2015, as the heat in the Nevada deserts began to gradually subside, an event occurred beside Highway 93 near the border with Utah, which shook the entire country. At 5:40 a.m., a truck driver named Thomas Reed noticed a strange figure in his headlights. The man was staggering, barely moving his bare feet on the hot asphalt. When Thomas stopped, he saw a living ghost, a young man whose body was so emaciated that every bone was clearly visible through his pale, blistered skin. He was 21-year-old Michael Nelson, who had been missing for over 380 days. He was immediately taken to the nearest medical center in Lincoln County. According to the medical report that later became part of the criminal proceedings, Michael weighed only 90 kilograms, which was a critical number for a man of his height. Doctors recorded deep second-degree sunburns on his shoulders and back, as well as numerous scars on his wrists and ankles. These scars had a characteristic ring-shaped appearance, which usually indicates the prolonged use of metal shackles or tight ropes. The individual was in a state of profound psychological shock. His pupils barely reacted to light, and his voice resembled a dry hiss. When detectives arrived at the infirmary, Michael began to tell a story that sounded like the plot of a horror movie. According to him, the tragedy began on the second day of his hike in Zion National Park, on August 15, 2014. The brothers were a few kilometers from the main trail when they encountered a man who introduced himself as an excavator. He appeared to be an experienced hiker, knew the area well, and offered to show them around. The boys discovered a secret network of caves that wasn't on any tourist map. Michael stated that John, intrigued by the opportunity to see the unique architectural forms of the natural grottos, agreed to follow the stranger. The trap quickly closed. The excavator lured them to a remote canyon, where the entrance to a disguised cave was hidden among a pile of rocks. Once inside, the man pulled out a gun. Michael described the kidnapper as a man with a fanatical glint in his eyes, a religious radical who professed. Michael's testimony recorded that the man called humanity a tumor on the body of pure nature and considered himself the orderer of the forest. He imposed a rigorous regime on the brothers, forcing them to memorize the so-called rules of the forest every day. Long texts on obedience to nature and renunciation of civilization. Any mistake in the words or attempt at argumentation was physically punished. For many months, the brothers lived in the shadows, chained to the cave walls. Michael said they tried to support each other, whispering escape plans, but as time went on, over time, John's will began to crumble. The most terrifying part of the story concerned the events of March 2015. Michael, trembling all over during the interrogation, said that one morning the kidnapper approached John and said that he had not passed the purification stage.
The man forcibly released the older brother from the chain and took him out of the cave. Michael never saw him again. A few hours later, the kidnapper returned alone. According to Michael, the man approached him, placed his hand on his shoulder, and said in a chilling voice, "Now your brother is part of the forestee. He will stay here forever. You still have to prove your loyalty." Michael's fate was decided in early September 2015. The kidnapper decided to celebrate some kind of personal anniversary associated with his stay in the wilderness. He took alcohol into the cave and was very drunk that night. Michael noticed that the man had made a mistake when locking his chain. The mechanism did not fit completely into place. Hoping that the kidnapper would fall into a deep sleep, the man freed his hand, discreetly stole a knife from the table, and left the cave. He ran through the night, guided by the stars and the sound of a distant highway, covering miles between thorny bushes and sharp rocks until he reached the highway. The police in Nevada and Utah acted immediately. Based on Michael's description, a task force was formed, including FBI agents and Zion Park rangers. They searched a specific area, a canyon of deep red sandstone, a camouflaged entrance resembling a crack in the rock, and a wooden door covered with animal hide. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras and search dogs trained to detect human scent were used, even in difficult weather conditions. Rescuers searched an area of more than 40 square miles, focusing on the wildest areas where the hermit could theoretically be hiding. However, after a week of intensive searching, the results were nil. There wasn't a single cave that remotely resembled Michael's description in the area he had specified. The forest rangers were perplexed. They knew every inch of the park, every cave known to excavators or speleologists. But the boys' testimony did not match the actual topography of the area. Despite the fact that Michael's body showed undeniable evidence of torture, the location of his capture remained unseen. This gave rise to the first wave of doubts among the first responders. Although detectives at the time explained this as a result of the victim's disorientation after a year in complete isolation, every effort was made to find at least some trace of the kidnapper, whom Michael called his only clue as to what had happened to his brother John. The world was following the story of the guy who came back from hell, unaware that the real questions about his story would soon emerge. In December 2015, the excitement surrounding the Nelson brothers' case began to gradually dissipate. The journalists who had been on standby for months outside the hospital and the family home shifted to new sensations, and the general public accepted Michael's story as a tragic but complete miracle. Utah State Police officially closed the investigation as a closed case. Despite all efforts, it was not possible to find any trace of the mysterious excavator or the disguised cave. The territory of Zion National Park was searched from top to bottom, but nature remained silent. Michael Nelson himself chose the path of maximum isolation. He turned down numerous offers to write a book or participate in television programs that promised him six-figure sums for an exclusive interview. Instead, he moved into a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city and took a job as a night packer at a large logistics warehouse. His colleagues recall that he was almost invisible, never participated in group meals, didn't engage in conversations, and always wore long-sleeved clothing to hide the numerous scars on his arms. To the world, he was a victim trying to piece his life back together, but to one person, he was the object of intense professional curiosity. Detective Alan Erickson, who participated in Michael's initial interrogations, couldn't shake the feeling that there was a logical void in the case. At night, when the department was empty, she would repeatedly examine hundreds of pages of protocols, rescue reports, and medical records. On December 11, 2015, his attention was drawn to a document that had been considered secondary during the first wave of the investigation. Michael's full toxicology report was done in the first few hours after he appeared on the track. In the blood chemistry column, along with indicators of severe exhaustion and vitamin deficiency, there was diphenhydramine. This was an antihistamine component that is commonly found in over-the-counter cold and allergy medications, but in large doses it acts as an extremely potent hypnotic and sedative. To an outsider, this might seem insignificant, but for Erickson, it was the first serious contradiction. According to Michael's official testimony recorded in the protocol on September 8, 2015, the kidnapper kept them in complete isolation from the civilian world. The boy stated that his jailer was a religious fanatic who despised all the achievements of modern science and medicine. Michael stated clearly that the kidnapper only gave them bitter-tasting herbal decoctions that were supposed to purify their spirits. There was no mention of pills, syrups, or any synthetic drugs in his story. The presence of a pure pharmaceutical drug in the blood of a man who had spent a year in a wild cave seemed a technical anomaly. Detective Erickson decided to test her theory and sought guidance from a toxicologist at the state medical center. The specialist confirmed that the concentration of diphenhydramine in Michael's body at the time of hospitalization was sufficient to induce a deep, almost narcotic sleep for 10 to 12 hours. Furthermore, the decomposition of the substance indicated that the drug had been injected into the body regularly over a long period. On December 15th, Erickson presented his observations to the department's management. She pointed out that Michael's story about a forest hermit with herbs directly contradicted the chemical composition of his blood. However, his enthusiasm was not met with support. His colleagues and the public prosecutor considered this an insignificant detail, which could be easily explained by the logic of the kidnapping. Perhaps the kidnapper mixed the crushed pills in the same doses to make the victims obedient, argued his partner. Or Michael himself found a packet of pills in his bags while fleeing and took them to stress himself out and then simply forgot about them because of the shock. For most detectives, Michael Nelson remained a martyred hero, and any attempt to find flaws in his words was seen as excessive harshness towards the victim. For Helen Erickson, however, this chemical detail became the first crack in a monolithic and perfect abduction story. In her professional diary, she made an entry dated December 17th. If he lied about what entered his system, he could have lied about what he saw. The detective began to act independently, outside the official timeline. She drew attention to another aspect, the condition of the scars on Michael's body. Although they looked horrific, the forensic scientist who performed the initial examination noted that the scars on his wrists were unevenly spaced. If a person had been chained up for a year, the nature of the damage would have been deeper at certain pressure points. Here, the scars resembled a series of small but distinct cuts, made at an angle a person usually chooses when inflicting self-harm. It was just an assumption that had no legal force, as long as the theory of the elusive maniac was still alive. But Erickson thought Michael's entire story, from the encounter with the bulldozer to his miraculous escape, was too cinematic, too calibrated. It lacked the chaos of real crime in the wild. It seemed someone was very diligently setting the stage for the return of the sole survivor. In late December, the detective began a second analysis of surveillance footage from the period before the brothers' disappearance in 2014. She wanted to understand who Michael Nelson was before he became a victim. And it was this step, which at first seemed like a routine check, that led her to the next discovery. It turned out that the quiet, compliant younger brother had his own secrets that he carefully kept hidden from his parents and family. The successful older brother. The first crack in his story began to widen, revealing an abyss at the bottom of which lay a completely different truth about the events at Zion Park. While Michael quietly worked in his warehouse, Detective Erickson began collecting evidence that would later transform the rescued hero into the prime suspect in the most high-profile case of the decade. In early January 2016, the Nelson brothers' investigation was officially reopened under top-secret classification. Detective Alan Erickson obtained permission to conduct a full audit of the two brothers' financial and consumption activities 30 days before their disappearance. The main focus shifted from the search for the mythical digger to an analysis of Michael Nelson's own training. Erickson suspected that the year in nature hadn't been an accident, but required careful, almost mathematical calculation. The first discovery came after checking Utah's pharmaceutical databases. Detectives gained access to the records of a small pharmacy called Green Life, located in a residential area across town from the Nelsons' home. According to the file, on August 7, 2014, exactly 1 week before the hike, Michael Nelson purchased 3 large packets of a diphenhydramine-based medication. Investigators were most shocked by how he purchased the medication. He used an outdated prescription form from his late grandfather, who had passed away 3 months prior to the events. The pharmacy's surveillance cameras captured Michael at 9:20 a.m. In the video, he appears calm, almost indifferent. He doesn't speak to the pharmacist more than necessary for the transaction and pays in cash to avoid leaving a digital trail on his bank statement. For Erickson, this was direct evidence of deliberate fraud. Michael couldn't have forgotten the medication due to shock, as he had gone to great lengths to obtain it illegally before the trip. The next stage of the investigation led detectives to an outdoor equipment store called Outdoors Master. Analysis of the filing records from August 10, 2014, revealed another part of the plan. Footage from the camera above the cash register shows Michael Nelson purchasing an abnormal amount of food. His shopping basket contained 42 high-protein energy bars and 26 packages of freeze-dried food in soft vacuum bags. The store clerk, who was later questioned as part of the undercover investigation, remembered the strange customer. According to him, the young man ignored the standard tourist kits and chose only items with the longest possible expiration date and minimum weight. Michael paid special attention to the packaging. He chose soft bags that are easily compressed, allowing him to pack a large amount of food into a limited space. The total cost of the purchase exceeded $300, and again, Michael paid with paper bills, avoiding using his own credit card. The most important piece of evidence was the re-examination of video footage from the parking lot. From Zion Park, taken on August 14, 2014, the day the brothers last communicated, FBI visual analysis experts used advanced image enhancement algorithms to compare the brothers' equipment. At 10:15 a.m., John Nelson got out of the car with a light backpack, holding no more than 25 liters. This was perfectly in line with his plans for a light 2-day hike, a change of underwear, a water bottle, and a light snack. John appears relaxed, locks the car, and walks confidently to the start of the West Rim Trail. The contrast with Michael was striking. The younger brother pulled an 80-liter expedition backpack from the trunk. The backpack's fabric was stretched so tightly that the seams at the bottom began to diverge, and the external zippers were tightened to the maximum. According to load tests, Michael's backpack weighed at least 60 kilograms. That was the weight for a long, autonomous expedition in complete isolation, not for a weekend outing with his brother. Upon reviewing the footage, Detective Erickson noticed Michael helping John sling his lightweight backpack over his shoulders. This gesture, which had previously seemed like a manifestation of care, now held a cold irony. John was absolutely certain they would return to civilization within 48 hours. Michael, on the other hand, knew his own supply of calories and medication would last for many months in the desert. The video also captured the moment Michael glanced at the parking lot for the last time before disappearing around the rocky bend. There wasn't a shadow of the separation anxiety his mother had mentioned on his face. Instead, the cameras captured the focused, almost professional expression of a man who had just successfully completed the first stage of a long operation. The geography of Michael's purchases spanned 3 different counties. He acted methodically, distributing his purchases among different stores and pharmacies to avoid attracting unnecessary attention with a large volume of specific goods. In one place, he bought a rope and a knife, in another, water filters, in a third, antiseptics, and the same medications according to someone else's prescription. These new facts completely shattered the narrative, the version of a sudden attack by a digger. No kidnapper could have known that the victim would have prepared in advance a backpack full of food and sleeping pills. The investigation began to realize that the cave the rescuers were searching was not an accidental trap. It was destiny. However, the main question remained. How did Michael manage to get his dominant and physically stronger brother to follow him into this trap? And where exactly on the 150,000-acre property was the location that Michael had so carefully prepared for their arrival? Detective Erickson began searching all the abandoned buildings, old mines, and hunting cabins that were not on the park's official maps. She knew that Michael could not carry such a load indefinitely. His base had to be within a 7 to 8 kilometer radius of the point of his last sighting. The undercover investigation entered its final stretch, preparing to present charges against Michael Nelson that would transform him from a surviving victim into the architect of his own horror. In January 2016, the investigation into the disappearance of the Nelson brothers entered the final phase. Active field searches were conducted, but this time the vectors of the rescuers' movement were determined not by Michael's words, but by the dry data from the examinations. Detective Alan Erickson involved leading dermatologists and forensic experts in the case. The object of their research was not the landscape, but Michael Nelson's skin. An analysis of the sunburns recorded in the boy's medical records during his hospitalization revealed a surprising anomaly. According to Michael's version, he spent almost 360 days in a dark cave, where the only source of light was the rare outings under the escort of his captor. However, the nature of the pigmentation and the condition of the epidermis suggested otherwise. Experts discovered that Michael had been regularly exposed to direct sunlight in the 4 months prior to his escape. Furthermore, the angle of the burns and their location on his shoulders and back indicated that he had spent at least 3 to 4 hours in the sun every day, between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. This completely refuted the legend of his captivity in a deep dungeon. Armed with this information, a group of experienced forest rangers and geologists set out for the Kolob Canyon area. They weren't looking for a cave, but a place where a person could hide for an extended period, having access to sunlight but remaining invisible to helicopters. On January 20th, 2016, after traveling 7 miles northwest of the official West Ram Trail route, the search team found a section that locals called Dead Loop, due to the difficult terrain and dense mountain mahogany vegetation. There, in a deep crevice hidden safely behind a pile of red rocks over 6 meters high, they discovered a structure. It was a dilapidated wooden cabin, likely built in the mid-20th century by hunters or Forest Service workers. The structure was not marked on any modern digital map of Zion Park. The cabin's roof was partially collapsed, and the darkened pine walls blended so seamlessly with the surrounding rocks that it was nearly impossible to identify, even at a distance of 50 meters. When the forensic lab experts entered, they didn't see a torture chamber but an organized hermit's life. The wooden table made of rough planks was in perfect order. In the corner, under the stone roof where the sun's rays fell directly on the floor at midday, there was an old sleeping bag. It was here, in this place, that Michael Nelson suffered the sunburns, which he later claimed were the result of an exhausting run in the desert. A search of the room yielded irrefutable evidence. Detectives found a stash of empty packaging under one of the floorboards. They were packages of high-calorie energy bars and soft packages of freeze-dried meat, the same specific food that Michael had secretly bought with cash at the Outdoors Master Store before starting his journey. The total number of packages indicated that the supplies would last 8 to 9 months of frugal consumption. Several old traces of blood were found on the walls and floor of the cabin using luminol. DNA analysis was performed 2 days later. It was confirmed that the blood belonged exclusively to Michael Nelson. At first glance, this corroborated his story of having been injured, but a more detailed inspection of the scene horrified investigators. There wasn't a single trace of another person's presence in the entire cabin, which was no more than 120 square meters. Forensic scientists carefully examined every inch of the walls, searching for the holes from the handcuffs, metal chains, or screws that Michael had described. The wood was intact. There wasn't a single scratch from the metal, nor a single dent from the handcuffs on his wrists and ankles that would have been left if he had been held there by force. Experts found hundreds of samples of epithelial hair in the air, in the cracks between the boards, and on household objects. All of them, without exception, belonged to Michael. Standing in the middle of that cabin on January 23rd, Detective Erickson realized the main point. There was never a digger. There was no religious fanatic, no kidnapping, no captivity. The cabin in Deadloop was not a prison, but a shelter. Volunteer. Michael Nelson spent a year alone there, methodically destroying his weight, self-harming, and watching the sun slowly change his appearance, preparing him for the final act of this play. The forest rangers who participated in the inspection noted that the cabin window overlooked the crevice where Michael's cap was found. The boy could watch the search helicopters for months, sitting in his hiding place, knowing that no one would find him. He was the architect of his own disappearance, calculating every detail, from the caloric content of his food to the angle of the sunlight. However, this documentation of his lie was missing a crucial detail. If Michael was alone in the cabin all this time, where was his brother John? Neither John's blood nor belongings were found on the cabin walls, nor was there any trace of his presence. The older brother, a successful architect and head of the family, had disappeared from the story right at the beginning without leaving even a fingerprint on that wooden box. The geography of Michael's lie was revealed, but this only emphasized the depth of the tragedy. The investigation now had evidence that Michael had faked his own kidnapping, but this didn't answer the question the Nelson parents asked themselves every night. Detective Erickson knew she now had every reason to interview him again, but she also knew that if Michael had spent a year in complete solitude preparing for this role, he wouldn't give up easily. The truth wasn't hidden within the cabin walls, but in the depths of his pathological jealousy, which he had disguised so carefully as a quiet brother. The next step was to psychologically attack the man who had created his own personal hell. In February 2016, when the evidence against Michael Nelson became too strong to ignore, experts from the IFBU's Behavioral Analysis Unit joined the case. Detective Alan Erickson understood that to obtain a confession from a man who had voluntarily spent a year in complete isolation, it was necessary to understand the mechanics of his thinking. The profilers began with a detailed study of Michael's past, interviewing dozens of people who had known him since childhood. The results of these conversations were paradoxical. Most of the classmates and neighbors of the Nelson family refused to believe that their younger brother had any involvement in John's disappearance. In their stories, Michael appeared as a safe haven, an extremely polite, calm, and compliant boy who always stayed in the background. He was the perfect son, recalled one of the neighbors, Mrs. Eleanor Gable. While John won cups and gave speeches at school assemblies, Michael was quietly helping his mother with shopping or mowing the lawn. He never raised his voice and was always the first to greet her. However, behind this impeccable facade, FBIM profilers could see the outlines of a personality they called the Shadow. He was the type of person who, lacking a bright identity of his own, completely dissolves into another but at the same time demands the absolute and total presence of the object of his affection. For Michael, that object was his older brother. Analysis of school records and teacher testimonies revealed the first signs of destructive behavior that the Nelsons considered childish quirks. One of the former coaches. The school's history recalled an incident that occurred when John was 16 and Michael was 14. After John won a crucial football match and became the school's star, Michael, instead of celebrating with everyone else, secretly went into the locker room. The next morning, John found his shirt torn to shreds. At first, his parents thought it had been done by envious people from the opposing team, unaware that it was his younger brother, unable to bear another triumph that alienated him from the family. Even more disturbing facts were revealed by John's friends at university. According to them, when his older brother got a girlfriend named Sarah, Michael's behavior became unpredictable. He began hilariously mimicking panic attacks and sudden choking fits on the very nights John planned to go on a date. John, feeling responsible for his weak brother, would stay home holding his hand while he regained his senses. It was a sophisticated form of manipulation aimed at controlling every step of the object of his pathological jealousy. On the 10th of In February 2016, a second, more thorough search was conducted under a secret warrant in Michael's room at his parents' house. Detectives were looking for any clue that could explain his year-long absence. In a ventilation shaft hidden behind a grate, they found an old diary with a black cover. The entries contained within were made in the 3 years prior to his disappearance. The diary's text became key to understanding the tragedy. In its pages, Michael described his feelings with documentary coldness. The month of July 2014 was filled with reflections on betrayal. Michael considered John's upcoming departure to study at an architecture school in another state as a personal act of desertion. A dated entry. The article from August 5th stated, "He thinks he can just pack his bags and leave. He thinks life outside the home is better than ours, but I won't allow him to become a stranger. I'm going to stop time. Here in the forest, where there is no one else, he will always be my brother." These lines, written in firm handwriting, became the actual plan of the crime for the investigation. Alongside the work of the profilers, a team of forensic scientists, led by Dr. Marcos Lowe, reanalyzed photographs of the scars on Michael's body. One important detail that had not been taken into account before was the fact that the man was left-handed. The experts modeled the injury process and arrived at an unequivocal conclusion. The angle of the cuts on his wrists and ankles perfectly matched the movements of Michael's left hand. The scars on the right side were deeper and more pronounced, while those on the left side were superficial, which is typical of self-harm. No third kidnapper would have chosen this path when injuring the victim. Robert Kinsey, an FBI profiling specialist, noted in his report that Michael Nelson was not a kidnapping victim. He was the director of his own martyrdom. He created the image of a digger as an external enemy to legitimize his absence and conceal the true reason for John's disappearance. His pathological need to possess his brother turned into a belief that it was better to see him dead, but his than alive, more free. By the end of February 2016, the investigation had a complete picture of the suspect's personality. The quiet guy, who for years hid his destructive impulses behind a mask of kindness, revealed himself to be a cold strategist. He methodically prepared for the role of victim, training to endure pain and hunger in an abandoned cabin. The whole story about the rules of the forest and the religious fanatic was just a figment of his deranged imagination, created to distract from the main issue. Michael Nelson was the only person who was with John in his final moments. Detective Erickson knew that the next step would be the most difficult. She needed to throw Michael off balance to force the shadow to appear. She was preparing the final interrogation, in which every detail from the cut football shirt to the diary entries would become a brick in the wall that would crush Michael and force him to finally tell the truth about what happened in the depths of Zion Park. The story of the miraculous return finally crumbled, revealing a horrific reality in which love and hate were so intertwined that they led to the irreparable. On February 28, 2016, at 9 a.m., Michael Nelson was officially arrested at his home. He was taken to the Central Police Station where Detective Helen Erickson was already waiting for him in interrogation room number 4. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The light from the fluorescent lamps reflected off the steel surface of the table, and the silence seemed almost physically palpable. Michael sat motionless with his hands under the table, staring at a single point on the wall. Detective Erickson began to act methodically. Without further ado, she began to lay out the results of months of secret work on the table. The first to surface were the printed images from the surveillance cameras at the pharmacy and the tourist shop, where Michael had secretly bought food and medicine. Next came copies of receipts for energy bars purchased in cash. Next, the detective placed on the table the results of a toxicology exam that confirmed the presence of sleeping pills in his blood, and the forensic doctor's conclusion about the nature of the cuts on his body, which perfectly matched the movements of the man's left hand. The final piece of evidence was the photographs of the same abandoned cabin in the Dead Loop area, where experts found only his biological traces. For 30 minutes, Michael didn't say a word. His breathing was becoming increasingly difficult and irregular, and his toes on his knees began to tremble. When Erickson leaned across the table and asked him directly, "Where is your brother John, really?" There was a long pause in the room. Suddenly, Michael shuddered and, without looking up, asked for the air conditioning to be turned off, complaining that he was too cold. The temperature in the room was normal, around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but he was shivering as if he had a fever. When the buzzing of the ventilation subsided, Michael's voice changed. It no longer sounded like the voice of a frightened victim. It became calm, uniform, and almost mechanical. According to the interrogation report, Michael began his story not with the events in the forest, but with the moment John received his acceptance letter from the Architecture University. The young man admitted that it was at that moment that a plan came to him. What was once a source of pride for the whole family became a declaration of war for him. Every word John said about his future life in another state, hundreds of miles from home, felt like a personal betrayal to Michael. The entire trip to Zion National Park was just a carefully orchestrated set. The night of August 15th, 2014, was the final straw. The brothers set up camp near an abandoned technical quarry, far from the main tourist routes. Around the campfire, John began to dream big again. He talked about the upcoming parties, new friends, and the opportunities that were opening up for him. Michael felt a physical pain in his chest as he listened. As he later explained during questioning, my heart was pounding against my ribs so hard that I could barely hear his words. All I could see was him walking away, leaving me alone in the shadows. When it was time for afternoon tea, Michael discreetly slipped a double dose of diphenhydramine into his brother's cup. The sleeping pill took effect quickly. John, confident in his safety and trusting his brother, fell asleep beside the fireplace. Michael waited for about an hour to ensure the drug's effect was maximized. Then he went to John's bed. According to Michael's testimony, he acted in cold blood. He strangled his own brother without taking his eyes off his face until the last breath left the 22-year-old's lungs. It was the only way to stop time, Michael told the detective, looking her directly in the eyes. It was the only way to keep him as my brother and not turn him into a stranger from another city. After the murder, Michael implemented the second part of his plan. He carried John's body to a deep technical trench near the edge of the quarry, a place that the forest rangers had only superficially inspected during the first operation because of the danger of a landslide. By throwing the body into an abyss more than 30 meters deep, he began his long game of sacrifice. He moved into a cabin that had been prepared beforehand, where he methodically starved himself and stabbed himself for a year, creating the image of a man who had been through hell. He deliberately exhausted himself so that no one, not the police nor his own parents, could suspect this younger brother weak and exhausted by the crime. Michael described in detail how he grew accustomed to solitude, how he counted every calorie to avoid premature death, and how he crafted a story about the excavator and the rules of the forest. He admitted that every detail of his legend was invented during long nights in his cabin, listening to the wind. He wanted his return to become a sensation that would forever close the question of what happened to John. Your plan almost worked. A year in complete isolation made her story so convincing that even experienced detectives believed her at first. When the interrogation came to an end, Michael fell silent again. He didn't look like a repentant murderer, but rather a man who had finally completed a complex architectural project. Detective Erickson noted in her report that after the confession, the boy's heart rate stabilized and the trembling disappeared. He detailed the coordinates of the crevice where he had thrown his brother's body, and even described how he had rolled up the tent and where he had hidden John's personal belongings so that they would never be found in a surface search. The monologue in the silence of Room 4 brought an end to the story of the miraculous rescue, replacing it with a dark chronicle of a pathological attachment that turned into murder. Michael Nelson had single-handedly destroyed his family's life, believing that his brother's death was an acceptable price to pay so that he would forever remain a part of their shared past. The investigators had only one thing to do: go to the coordinates and find what remained of the family's pride and joy at the bottom of the rock crevice in Zion Park. The trial of Michael Nelson, which began in May 2016 at the St. George District Court, became one of the most prominent events in the history of IUTA case law. The courtroom was surrounded by dozens of journalists, and all hearings were broadcast live. However, the courtroom was oppressively silent. The boys' parents, Mary and Robert Nelson, sat in the front row holding hands. For them, this trial was the final act of a tragedy. They lost both their children in one night, one physically and the other as a person. Based on the coordinates provided by Michael during questioning, a team of experts in complex rescue operations traveled to the Kolob Canyons area. On March 3, 2016, at 2:15 p.m., human remains were discovered at the bottom of a narrow technical trench approximately 131 feet deep. The body was located in an inaccessible spot at the foot of a steep cliff, where, due to the terrain, there was constant darkness, even on clear days. DNA analysis confirmed that it was John Nelson, 22 years old. The medical examiner's report read during the June 12th hearing was short and categorical. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Traces were found in the cervical vertebrae and soft tissues, indicating prolonged compression. This was consistent with Michael's version of the murder of his brother who was sleeping. Furthermore, a high concentration of the same sleeping pill that Michael had secretly bought with his grandfather's prescription a week before the hike was found in the fabric remains. The defense attempted to appeal to the defendant's mental state, insisting on a pathological attachment bordering on insanity. However, the prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of a long and methodical preparation. Buying food a month before the event, choosing an abandoned cabin as a base, imitating self-harm, all of this attested to the cold calculation and full awareness of their actions. On July 15, 2016, the judge delivered the final verdict. Michael Nelson was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in Utah, without the possibility of early release. When the verdict was read, there were no shouts or applause in the courtroom. Michael's father simply covered his face with his hands, while his mother remained seated motionless, staring into space. The most terrifying moment of the trial was the defendant's last word. Michael stood up, adjusted the sleeves of his prison robe, which concealed his scars, and looked at his parents. There wasn't a single drop of remorse or regret in his voice. According to the court report, he uttered a phrase that will forever be etched in the memory of those present. "You talk about stolen lives, but you don't understand. That year in Zion was the best time of my life." There in the silence, John was finally in no hurry. He was no longer dreaming of another city or packing his bags. Finally, he was completely mine. After the trial, the Nelsons made a brief statement to the press, announcing their move to the East Coast. They sold their house and left Utah forever, trying to erase the name of the national park, which had become the tomb of their future. The Nelson brothers' case remains in the archives as a classic example of how the worst traps are not created by nature or by random criminals. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous captors are those who hold us captive, not in camouflaged underground caves, but in the twisted labyrinths of our own diseased imagination.